In reassuring my mother and Ingrid, I told them that I was just going to protect Berlin. I probably believed it myself at the time. I didn't know that history was inexorably moving towards the grand and terrible events in which I was destined to become one of the participants. September 1938. After the First World War, the Sudetenland was part of Czechoslovakia and comprised almost a third of the country's total area. There were 3.5 million ethnic Germans living in this area. Already at the beginning of 1938, Hitler constantly stated in his speeches that Germans in Czechoslovakia were being oppressed in every possible way. In those days, I heard repeatedly on the radio and read in the newspapers that the Sudeten Germans lived in incredible poverty and were persecuted by the Czechs, and that it was the Sudetenland that had the highest percentage not only of suicides, but also of infant mortality in all of Europe. Soon after Austria was annexed to Germany without a shot being fired in March 1938, Germans living in the Sudetenland began to demand a referendum in which the people of the Sudetenland could decide for themselves whether the area should remain part of Czechoslovakia or become part of Germany. However, the referendum was never held. Moreover, the Czechoslovak government soon introduced troops into German-populated areas and declared martial law in their territories. Living in Germany, we constantly heard the propaganda in those days that Hitler would not leave it like that and would do everything to make the Sudeten Germans stop tolerating the outrages of the Czechs and live in one house with the nation again. And indeed, on September 29, 1938, an agreement was drawn up in Munich, signed the next day by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler himself. From that moment on, the Sudetenland was formally ceded to Germany. I was part of the troops that were to enter the Sudetenland. Anton, Michael, and 17 other snipers rode in the same truck with me. Together we made up a special sniper platoon. Our truck moved behind the column of light tanks. Each of us did not let go of his carbine. We had regular K98K Army carbines, supplemented with bayonet knives and telescopic sights. However, our telescopic sights could only be called suitable for snipers. These sights gave only 2.5x magnification, which was obviously not enough for aiming from considerable distances. Some of my co-workers tried to talk to each other and even make jokes. But it didn't work well. Nervous tension had taken its toll. Sergeant Berger, who commanded our platoon, warned us in advance that if there were any complications in the operation, the most difficult work would be assigned to us. At first we all took it with youthful bravado, but the longer the journey went on, the more we were gripped by unpleasant premonitions. I myself was very much afraid that I might be wounded. What if I was wounded in such a way that the doctors would have to cut off my arm or leg? How would I be able to help my mother and Ingrid when I got home? I, and probably all the others, didn't even think about the possibility that one of us might be killed. We hadn't seen a single battle yet. We didn't realize that in war, people killed for real. Nevertheless, it was unpleasant. My friends Anton and Michael were also silent, looking at the floor. Sergeant Berger was riding on horseback behind our truck. He was from Austria and was in his 40s. He had been in World War I. His face seemed very calm, and that gave us confidence in such a situation. After a while, our truck suddenly stopped. I leaned out of the back and saw that Sergeant Berger had pulled up to the driver's cab to find out the reason for the stop. After about a minute, I realized what was wrong. Our truck had started to detour around a tank that had stalled in the middle of the road. During the next 2 hours of the trip, looking out of the back of the truck, I counted about 10 more broken German tanks that could not continue, and after all, these were the newest machines of our designers. What I saw struck me unpleasantly. What would happen if something like that happened during the battle? However, I kept my thoughts to myself. A few more hours passed, and we crossed the border of Czechoslovakia. When we entered the Sudetenland, I expected to be greeted with flowers. In any case, we had been told many times before that this was how the German troops entering Austria were greeted. In the Sudetes, however, the inhabitants did not throw flowers to the German soldiers. Of course, many local Germans were happy to welcome our troop column, but from time to time we noticed frowning, disgruntled looks. Not only Czechs, but sometimes even Sudeten Germans looked at us like that. It made me think. We had been told that all the Germans in the Sudetenland were waiting for us as deliverers. In reality, it turned out that many of them in Czechoslovakia did not live as badly as Hitler had described. I was finally convinced of this during the time I was in the Sudetenland as part of the occupation troops. Of course, many Sudeten Germans really wanted their territories to become part of Germany again, but in most cases this was due more to ideological motives than to the notorious oppression by the Czechs. Naturally, at that time, when I was young, I did not formulate all this for myself so clearly. But it was clear to me that there was a significant difference between reality and the words of the authorities. However, I did not even tell Anton and Michael about it. I was not a fighter by nature. I was not an oppositionist. I was an ordinary, normal person, and I didn't want any trouble. Contrary to our misgivings, we met no armed resistance in Czechoslovakia. Moreover, during the time I was there as part of the occupation forces, no incidents occurred either. During this period, I even received a short vacation home. However, even at home, I was very cautious in talking about what I had seen. It wasn't because I didn't trust my mother and Ingrid. But they could have said too much, and that would have brought trouble not only to me, but to them as well. The only thing was that I had once mentioned that the sights on our carbines were not suitable for sniper shooting, and most surprisingly, my relatives helped me to solve this problem. On the last day before my return to the army, I received 2 gifts, from my mother and Ingrid. The first was a small locket with 2 pictures of Ingrid and our child in it, but the second gift made me literally open my mouth in surprise. It was a Zeiss telescopic sight of 6 times magnification. At that time, such sights were not yet produced for standard army small arms, but my mother consulted with my father's combat friend, and he helped her to choose such a telescopic sight for hunting carbines so that it could be easily installed on my K98K carbine. It later turned out that this scope was indeed perfect for sniper work. I'm afraid my poor mother had to spend a significant portion of her savings on it, but she did love me very much, as I loved her. With thoughts of home, it was not easy for me to get back in the field. Nevertheless, the oath obliged me, and a few days later I was already at our military base in the Sudetes. There I got my carbine back. It took me very little time to attach a new sight to it. I mounted it high enough to be able to fire without using the optics if necessary. After that, I decided to shoot my carbine. It turned out that with the new sight I could easily hit targets at a distance of more than 300 meters, and even much farther. This delighted me, although I had not yet fully realized how valuable such a sight would be in combat conditions. I stayed in the Sudetenland for a few more months, and on March 15, 1939, I was again with my platoon in the back of an army truck. Hitler decided to subjugate most of the territory of Czechoslovakia. German troops entered Prague in huge columns consisting of tanks, armoured personnel carriers, trucks and other equipment. This time our morale was extremely high. We were sure that everything would go off without a hitch, because we knew that the Czechs were not fighters. However, what we saw exceeded even our wildest expectations. The Czechs met us in Prague, raising their hands in the German army salute and shouting, "Heil Hitler!" I was extremely amazed by this. I didn't believe that everything here was clean. And I was right. Michael had a friend who was in the SS, so he told Michael over a glass of schnapps. He said that the Czechs had been warned, and if they hadn't saluted so furiously, they would have met a very unenviable fate. I think that the SS would have taken an active part in the massacre of the Czechs. I must say that the SS troops in Germany were considered elite. By and large, they really were. During the following years of the war, I was repeatedly convinced that the SS guys could do the impossible, where the Wehrmacht troops were powerless. As soldiers, the SS were almost flawless, and for that they could not but be respected. But there was another strict selection criterion for these troops. selfless devotion to Hitler and the corresponding ideals. Personally, I have always been far from these ideals, although my attitude to Hitler changed after a while for the better, but without fanaticism. This probably explains why I never got close to any of the SS men during the war. Like the Sudetenland, the capital of Czechoslovakia surrendered to us without bloodshed. Surprisingly, I later learned that the Czechs had a well-developed military industry. However, after what happened, all their factories producing armaments were taken over by the Germans. It is still incomprehensible and surprising to me that the Czechs, who had tanks, artillery, anti-tank guns and various small arms, did not offer us any resistance. As a result, all their armament also went to the Wehrmacht. However, we, the soldiers, were more than satisfied with such an outcome. We had no losses and we felt like heroes. After all, even without a fight, the enemy surrendered to us. I stayed in Prague for another 5.5 months. All this time I wrote home several times a week. I missed my family very much and was worried that the first year of my son's life was not passing before my eyes. However, I consoled myself with the fact that my service was going more than smoothly. Prague in those days was quite a welcoming city for us, and when we were released on leave, we could even afford to flirt with beautiful Prague women. However, I loved my wife, so I personally never went further than flirting. But anyway, I hoped that the rest of my term of service would go just as easily. I must say that I had every reason for such hopes. In May 1939, Hitler signed an agreement with Italy, as a result of which this country became an official ally of Germany. A little later, on August 23, 1939, a non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia was concluded. A few days afterward, I learned that our division would be among the troops that would enter Poland. This did not cause me any apprehension. I was sure that the same thing that had happened in Czechoslovakia would be repeated there. The only inconvenience was the order forbidding me to tell anyone about the forthcoming operation. Accordingly, I found it very difficult to write my last letter home before this campaign. I wrote it in general terms. I said that my service was going as well as before and that I missed my mother, Ingrid, and our little child very much. On the night of September 1st, 1939, I was in a truck that was driving through Czechoslovakia, but inexorably approaching the Polish border. It was still several hours before dawn. September 1939. Our column stood about 20 kilometres from the Polish border. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, we started moving towards Poland. Sitting in the truck, we joked about how zealously the Poles would salute and shout, "Heil Hitler!" But after a while I noticed that Sergeant Berger's face, this time he was travelling with us in the back of the truck, did not look as carefree as our mood. This gave me an unpleasant apprehension. After a while we heard the roar of engines somewhere in the air. "It's Polish airplanes," the sergeant explained dryly. "And what? They also have airplanes?" Anton was surprised, continuing to smile nonchalantly. Michael was equally optimistic. I felt a little uncomfortable, but nevertheless I was able to control myself. And one of our snipers suddenly panicked. He even jumped up from his seat, then sat down again. I thought Sergeant Berger was going to yell at him, but of course that wouldn't have done any good. But our sergeant was a shot in the arm, he said. Job, they came close to the enemy positions, and the Poles turned to flight. It's good that some of you are afraid. Fear will help you be careful and keep you alive if things don't go as well as they used to. Just don't forget that cowards die first. Control your fear. Perhaps Sergeant Berger's speech was not so pathos, but the general sense of what he said was exactly like that, and I remembered his words exactly like that. And you know, it helped me a lot in all the battles that followed. Nevertheless, most of us did not pay much attention to the sergeant's words at that time. We were on our way to Poland to be victorious. There were jokes going around in the truck again. At 4:50 we crossed the river Odra, which was the Polish border. Tanks were ahead of us, other divisions were pulling behind us. Of course, from the truck I could not even roughly estimate the number of troops, but the roar of the engines of our equipment was very strong, and I had the feeling that much more serious forces were thrown against Poland than during the invasion of Czechoslovakia. When we crossed the border, I thought that now the Poles would open fire. But they didn't. Either they were not expecting us, or they were not going to resist. The silence, muffled only by the roar of the engines, seemed endless. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. But then, suddenly, there were gun salvos and small arms fire somewhere in the distance. Poles will soon be repeating, "Heil Hitler," instead of "Our Father," Anton stammered, barely having time to finish his joke. The rumble of gunfire and explosions came closer and closer. Before we knew it, Sergeant Berger shouted an order. "Everybody out! Open fire on the Poles!" We began to jump out of the truck in a hurry. Dawn was just beginning. But even in the semi-darkness I could see the Poles who were firing at our column. They used the rough terrain, trees, and a few peasant houses nearby as cover. The Poles were very numerous, but apparently our appearance took them by surprise, so they did not even have time to dig trenches. They had only a few hastily dug machine gun cells. Here it should be said that in addition to small arms, the enemy had machine guns and light anti-tank guns. But what is most interesting, behind the main forces of the Poles, I saw a lot of people on horseback. While we were still riding in the truck, the sergeant told us that the Poles had cavalry, which was considered to be their elite branch of the army. There were a lot of people on horseback, perhaps a whole cavalry regiment, but they stood still in indecision and were in no hurry to rush to the attack. I thought about it afterwards. What else could they do? To rush with sabres at the tanks would have been ridiculous. Of course, we had a story that Polish lancers tried to attack our armoured vehicles with sabres, but I think it's just a story. I've never seen it myself. Nevertheless, the Polish infantry was firing very hard at us. Their machine guns were not silent. Their guns managed to hit 2 or 3 of our tanks. We had to hide behind our armoured vehicles. That didn't save everyone, and already there were cries of wounded German fighters. Naturally, there were also the first killed. I didn't think about it. I even forgot that I was a sniper. I just fired indiscriminately in the direction of the Poles. The rest of the guys in my platoon did the same. This went on for a few minutes until Sergeant Berger yelled at us, "Are you snipers or what? Come on, destroy the Polish machine gunners." Hearing such a shout, I immediately came to my senses. A few moments later, in the crosshairs of my sight, appeared a man who was firing a machine gun at us. I pulled the trigger. Through the telescopic sight, I saw that another soldier jumped up to the Pole who had hit me, and another Pole took the place of his fallen comrade to fire the machine gun instead. This could not be allowed, and there was nothing left for me to do but to pull the bolt and pull the trigger again. This went on several more times. I was the only one in the platoon who had a telescopic sight that allowed me to kill enemies at that distance in the dawn twilight. It was the first time I'd ever killed a living person, but I didn't think about it. My next target was the artillerymen who were firing an anti-tank gun at our armoured vehicles. The first one I hit exactly in the chest, and then killed and wounded several more of them. And after another 10 to 15 minutes, the battle quieted down. "Our tanks did their. We won," shouted the guys from my platoon. And I was vomiting, thinking about the fact that for the first time in my life, people died by my hand. Sergeant Berger came up to me. He said, "All right, Gunther, you had to go through this. 20 years ago, I also vomited when I killed a man for the first time. But you saved your comrades. And that's the most important thing. Remember, if you pity the enemy, it could cost the life of your friend or even yourself. You're not even fighting for Hitler here, not for Germany, but for your friends and for yourself." Sergeant Berger said the last words in a whisper, so that I was the only one who could hear them. You know, I thought about it many times during the war and afterward. I'm sure he was right. During the battle, my friends Anton and Michael also managed to shoot some Poles, but it was easier for them, especially since they managed to kill fewer people than I did. I alone had killed 5 or 6 people and wounded probably as many. There was confusion on the faces of Anton and Michael, but nothing more. Everyone in my platoon was alive, but a few of our guys were wounded. The medics immediately rushed around them. "Will you help the wounded Poles?" I asked a naive question. "Sorry, kid, but your Poles will be on your conscience. We were ordered to help only the Germans." One of the medics smirked at me. Apparently, he had already heard that I had shown special marksmanship in this battle. I felt nauseous again, but I restrained myself. Standing next to me was Michael. When I looked at him, I realized that he was also affected by the medic's words. But Michael remained silent. There was no time to think about what had happened. The order to pursue the retreating Poles was given. We rushed forward, stepping over the bodies of the enemy, over the corpses of our comrades. Some of the Poles were still alive and did not stop moaning. Michael and I almost tripped over the body of a Polish soldier who was screaming, missing both his legs. "No one will help him. He will suffer for a long time," Michael said quietly and pointed his rifle at the Pole. After a few seconds of hesitation, Michael fired. I felt sick again. But in that situation, Michael's act was really an act of mercy. Looking at him, I saw that Michael was shaking all over. Our tanks chased the Polish cavalry and the remnants of infantry all the way to the suburb of Kalitz. At the same time, the tanks' machine guns were not silent. We followed the tanks and also periodically fired shots. From time to time, some detachment of retreating Poles occupied along the way, more or less convenient for defence positions, and then a short battle was fought. But they were doomed. They could do nothing against the avalanche of our tanks. As a result, all our way to the town of Kalitsu was strewn with the corpses of horses and men. On the outskirts, we received the order to stop. Just then, I heard the roar of airplanes. Our bombers were flying to bomb the town. Talking to our lieutenant, Sergeant Berger told us, "Men, now you can rest until our Air Force finally destroys the Polish artillery in the northern part of the city." He smiled. "You well deserved at least a short rest." We all sat down directly on the grass. However, our sergeant did not want the Poles to have the slightest chance to take us by surprise. So he put 4 of us on guard duty. I was one of the 4. We set up behind a boulder on a small hill near where the platoon was stationed. Through binoculars, I had a good view of the suburb of Kalitz. I looked at the 1-story houses, which looked much less solid than we had in Germany. Something made me think of my own house, of my family. My son was already in his 2nd year, and I hadn't even seen him take his first steps. I remembered Ingrid. I remembered my mother's words again about not being overly brave, about taking care of myself. All of this made me pull my mind away from my thoughts and focus on watching. It was the right thing to do if I wanted to stay in one piece. The suburb of Kalitz was deserted. Airplanes were still circling in the sky above the city, and the rumble of explosions was unceasing. The Poles obviously had no time at all to attack us. I realized that soon we would begin to storm the city. However, there must have been some kind of hitch. Perhaps it was due to the tanks being out of action. But I can only speculate. Ordinary soldiers weren't privy to such things. But anyway, after a while, Sergeant Berger gave us the order to entrench. At the same time, the bulk of the platoon dug trenches, and 4 men were still on duty in case of a Polish attack. Those who were working with the shovel periodically changed with those on duty. When everything was ready, I was stationed in the same trench with Anton and Michael. We discussed the details of the battle we had experienced. Anton never ceased to marvel at how quickly the Poles were retreating under the onslaught of our equipment. Michael and I were also satisfied with such a situation, although our mood was not so carefree. After a while, Anton talked about how good I was that I had killed so many Poles. It was the first time in my life that I had killed living people. I could only reply to that. "We should take it easy," said Michael, although it was obvious from his face that he did not take it too easy either. Anton began to persuade us fervently. "These are enemy soldiers. The Poles wanted to exterminate all the Germans who lived in Poland. We were just ahead of them." After Czechoslovakia, I didn't trust this kind of propaganda, But I didn't change Anton's mind. First of all, it was dangerous because someone else could hear me. Secondly, I knew that it would certainly be easier for my comrade if he thought as he thought. After a while, Sergeant Berger announced to us that the field kitchens had fallen behind the troops and we would have to eat our supper with dry rations. We started pulling them out of our knapsacks. Our dry rations consisted of 750 grams of bread, 45 grams of butter or fats, 120 grams of sausages, raw or canned, as well as canned fish, cheese, and 200 grams of jam or artificial honey. We were also given 7 cigarettes or 2 cigars each day and 1 small bag of candy. We ate dinner, drinking our food with water from field flasks that hung from our belts. I wasn't assigned to guard duty during the night, but when they called out, I thought I still wouldn't be able to sleep. It seemed to me that the Poles I had killed, as well as the enemy soldier who had been shot by Michael and who had been left without legs, would be flashing before my eyes without end. And indeed, I thought about all this for some time. But soon fatigue took its toll, and I fell into a dreamless sleep. I should note that I never dreamed of fighting in the war. Apparently, there is some mechanism in the human brain which in such situations helps a man to rest from war, at least in his sleep. I started dreaming about battles and deaths only a few years later. In the morning we were awakened by Sergeant Berger's voice. "Wake up," he shouted, moving from trench to trench. When I crawled out of my trench, I saw that a field kitchen truck had already pulled up to the camp. For breakfast, we were given potatoes with vegetables and sausages, the same as in the dry rations, only hot. We all immediately pounced on the warm food with joy. In addition to it, we were also each given a cup of hot ersatz coffee, and we were also able to fill our empty flasks with water, and we were given dry rations for the next few days. While we were eating breakfast, our artillery, which had been pulled to Kalitz overnight, began its artillery preparation. Anton was cheerful. He thought that after yesterday's aerial bombardment and today's artillery preparation, the Poles themselves would run to surrender to us as prisoners. Yes, it would be better for them. Michael agreed with him. But I was not so calm myself. What if the Poles decided to continue their resistance? That meant that we would have to fight in a town where we would be separated from the enemy by only a few houses, and probably even less. In such a situation, a sniper risks his life no less, and perhaps even more, than an ordinary soldier. Nevertheless, I gathered my will into a fist, and the fact that I was prepared in advance for the worst served me well during the subsequent battle. Before the attack began, each of us was given 7 rounds of ammunition. We were all astonished at the small amount. I myself had used up more than 20 cartridges the previous day, and not all my comrades had spent them as sparingly. However, there was no cause for concern, for each of us still had a certain amount of ammunition, which had been given to us before the operation began. I myself, together with 7 new ones, had about 40 cartridges as a result. The tank division bypassed the city from the eastern side and disappeared over the horizon, moving in a northwestern direction. I realized that we would have to enter Kalitz without tank support. Well, I was ready for that. We advanced, running from building to building. At first, we didn't see any enemy at all on our way, but after a few minutes, during another stop, I suddenly saw rifle barrels sticking out of the windows of a building 50 meters away from us. I yelled, "Get down!" and hastily collapsed to the ground. Many guys from my platoon immediately followed my example, but some kept moving forward, pointing their fingers at me as if I were crazy. Within seconds, the Poles unleashed a literal hail of bullets on them. The enemies were firing from several neighbouring houses. Coming out of my stupor, I returned fire. The distance was very short, and the Poles did not expect to face snipers at all. I simply aimed my telescopic sight at the head of the next enemy and pulled the trigger. Like in a movie, after almost every shot I fired at a Pole, his rifle fell out of the window. The rest of the guys in my platoon also started shooting at the enemy. After another minute, we were supported by machine gunners from the neighbouring platoon. When I had used up my second magazine, our mortars finally appeared. The mines fired from their 80mm mortars rained down on the buildings where the Poles were huddled. Explosions rumbled. Changing magazines once again, I allowed myself a quick look around. I saw that among my comrades there were already dead and wounded. Some were wounded in the stomach. They were squirming on the ground and moaning. But their groans were inaudible over the din of the battle. One of our machine gunners got a bullet in his throat right before my eyes as he was trying to insert a new belt into his MG-34. This fighter collapsed, grabbing his throat and twitching convulsively. Another fighter nearby took one look at him and, apparently deciding that there was no help for him, crawled over to his machine gun, inserted the ribbon and opened fire on the Poles. When our mortars practically blew to bricks and chips the buildings in which the Polish soldiers were hiding, the intensity of the enemy's fire weakened considerably. I realized that the amount of ammunition I had would not be enough if things continued in the same way. So I decided to take a risk and crawled up to a few of our dead to get the remaining ammunition. As a result, I replenished my stockpile and even shared some of it with Michael. Our regiment continued to move deeper into the city. More and more often we came across burning and already burnt-out buildings. This was the result of the bombing and the morning's artillery preparation. The streets were shrouded in smoke. I coughed from the accumulated cinders in the air. Most of the surviving houses stood without roofs and without glass in their windows. There were many dead bodies lying on the sidewalks that had been torn apart by bombs and shells. They were mostly Poles, both military and civilian. Most of them had been killed by shrapnel. I came across what was left of a Polish machine gun nest. There was a medley of the bodies of 2 or 3 Poles. A bomb or shell had hit their machine gun cell, leaving a crater in its place. Shots and explosions were heard from all sides. The Poles were retreating under our onslaught, but some of them remained in their positions to cover the retreat of their comrades. Nevertheless, we continued to push hard into the depths of the city. On the way, we ran into buildings to inspect them and to prevent Polish soldiers from hitting us from the rear. In one of the houses, I saw 2 frightened women. They were frightened to the point that they couldn't even cry, and we kept bumping into women crying. It was as if they were waiting for us to kill or rape them at any second. Some of them had children, some of them were wounded. One woman even came at us with fists. We pushed her away. But none of us even hit her. We were not barbarians, we were all mortified by what we saw. However, the battle continued, and to survive, one could not take such things into one's head. When our platoon advanced to the centre of Kalitz, we heard the rumble of heavy machine guns. The Poles were well entrenched in this part of the city and continued to hold a stubborn defence here. German infantrymen from other platoons seeking cover began to occupy the houses surrounding the central area of the town. I moved forward, staying close to Michael, Anton, and Sergeant Berger. When we reached a house that was already occupied by ours, I saw a little ahead, in the narrow passage between the houses, the bodies of German soldiers lying side by side. There were about 10 of them. Probably they had all been suddenly covered by machine gun fire. Sergeant Berger ordered one of our riflemen to crawl up there and reconnoitre the situation. "There's a machine gun nest there." The rifleman's report confirmed our fears. "How far away?" Sergeant Berger clarified. "About 200 metres. The sergeant looked at me and Anton. "Deal with it," he ordered. "Well, an order is an order." "Anton, follow me," I said to my friend. And we crawled, holding our carbines in front of us. When we got close to the corpses and saw the barrels of 2 Polish heavy machine guns pointed directly at us, I became really scared. But I calmed myself with the fact that our uniforms did not differ from those of the dead, and it should at least somehow disguise us. "We should shoot at the same time," Anton whispered to me. "Okay," I answered, instantly assessing the reasonableness of his decision. "I'll shoot the left one, you shoot the right one." We carefully stuck out the barrels of our rifles, placing them on the corpses. It was the most dangerous moment. If the Poles had noticed the glare from our telescopic sights, we'd both be dead. But fortunately, that didn't happen. Anton and I put the crosshairs on the machine gunners. 1, 2, 3. We both pulled the triggers at the same time. My bullet hit the top of the Polish gunner's forehead. I aimed a few centimetres lower, but I didn't take into account the distance to the target. Nevertheless, the enemy was still destroyed. Anton's shot was no less accurate. "We did it!" he shouted. "Don't get distracted," I shouted, shooting at another Polish fighter who wanted to jump to the machine gun instead of his fallen comrade. Anton's shot rang out. He missed. Perhaps it was because his telescopic sight was much worse than mine. However, the surviving Pole did not try to crawl to the machine gun, but ran away in panic. Anton caught up with him with the next shot. We looked at each other. We both had burning eyes and full of adrenaline in our blood. We managed to eliminate the danger from the machine gun nest. "Watch the street," I threw Anton, and I turned around. Sergeant Berger was watching us from the corner of the building. With a nod, I let him know that the task was done. He nodded back, and our platoon began to move forward again. When Sergeant Berger came upon the bodies of German soldiers killed by Polish machine gunners, he broke off halves from their soldier medallions. German soldiers' medallions consisted of 2 halves, one of which was to remain on the body of the killed man, and the other was to be taken away to be added to the casualty lists. Young fools! Why did they all rush out without looking? At least they should have taken pity on their mothers. The sergeant couldn't help himself. Despite his harsh words, it was obvious that he felt very sorry for the dead. But after a moment his face was stern and tense again. Sergeant Berger took out his binoculars and scrutinized the street in front of us. "Those devils are holed up in those 2 neighbouring concrete buildings," he said, continuing his observation. "It won't be easy to smoke them out. They've got machine gun. What do we do?" was going through my head. And then I saw an officer with the rank of captain heading straight for our sergeant. Along with the officer was about 8 infantry platoons. He began to question Sergeant Berger about the situation on our section. After listening to his report, the captain said, "Sergeant, you did a good job. Will your snipers be able to cover us if we try to take these concrete buildings?" "Yes, Captain," Berger replied. "Good. Kill every Pole who dares to poke his head out." "Yes, sir." Berger's face showed concern for a moment, and after a moment he turned to me and to Anton and Michael standing next to me. "Well, guys, let's show our enemies how the Germans can fight. We will do everything that depends on us." Anton answered for all of us, smiling. And Michael and I suddenly passed on his optimism. Our platoon crawled forward. As a cover, I decided to use the very cell which dug Polish machine gunners. Michael and Anton set up around the corner of a house not far from me. Looking through my telescopic sight at the windows of the concrete houses in which the Poles were huddled, I immediately saw the enemy gunner. He was aiming his rifle at one of our fighters who were crawling toward the buildings. Every fraction of a second was precious. I pointed the crosshairs of the telescopic sight at the enemy and pulled the trigger. Now this Pole was no longer a threat. However, the closer the German platoons got to the concrete buildings, the more intense were the rifle shots and machine gun bursts. I relentlessly searched for new targets and pulled the trigger. The other snipers did the same. Meanwhile, the captain's platoons continued the assault, and already in the buildings flew mines fired from their mortars. Smoke was pouring out of the windows. After a while, I could no longer find a target in the windows of the houses. Apparently, the battle was going on inside the buildings. Nevertheless, we had to stay where we were and keep looking for targets and be ready for any unforeseen development. This time, everything ended safely. 15 minutes later, a contact from the captain came running to our sergeant. Both concrete buildings had been safely taken. We could now take up positions in them in case the Poles made a counterattack. However, there were not as many Polish soldiers in these buildings as the captain had expected. This meant that the main battles for the city were still ahead of us, and for the rest of the day we continued to move forward, just like that, covering the captain's platoons, which stormed more and more buildings occupied by Poles. At the same time, I was panic-stricken that I would run out of ammunition, and at every opportunity I took it from the ammunition bags of the dead. Sergeant Berger watched each of us carefully. After taking another building, he came up to me and said, "You are a good soldier, Gunther. This is the first time I've seen a young sniper be so accurate. I am glad that you serve under me. Such praise, heard from the stern Sergeant Berger, could have turned my head. However, fate wanted to cool my ardour and make me behave with caution and prudence. And caution and prudence, as we know, are the main qualities that allow a sniper to survive." It happened in the afternoon. When I was looking through the windows of another building occupied by Poles, I suddenly saw an enemy soldier with a sniper rifle. It was a complete surprise to me. For some reason, I did not even think about the fact that Poles could have snipers too. Before I knew it, his bullet had broken the strap of my helmet, scratching my cheek. Instinctively, I collapsed to the ground. Some sixth sense told me that I had to play dead, or I would be. I lay motionless for several minutes that seemed endless. During that time I remembered Ingrid, my mother, and my little son. I remembered that a sniper should never fire more than one shot from the same position. But in those combat conditions, it was simply impossible to follow that rule. I thought about how much I had not yet accomplished in my life. I prayed to God that the enemy sniper would not decide to shoot me again, just in case. Then I heard Michael's confused voice. "Gunther, are you alive?" I cautiously lifted myself up. Soon the building was taken, and I learned that a Polish sniper had killed 2 guys from my platoon. We were so furious that we wanted to kill him ourselves. But we couldn't find even his sniper rifle in the captured building. Maybe the Polish sniper somehow escaped. Or maybe he just took the scope off his rifle, hid it, and pretended to be a regular soldier. Either way, I realized that the enemy might have snipers too, so if I wanted to survive, I had to find them first and be the first to shoot them without missing. Of course, that's easier said than done. But I learned a good lesson. By evening, the main force of Poles that remained in the centre of the city was surrounded. They surrendered. And they, disarmed, were taken to the southern outskirts of Kalitz. The rest of the city had already been taken, so Kalitz was captured by our division. I watched the refugees coming out of the town, laden with their meagre belongings. They were women with children and old men. There were so many of them that it seemed as if all the inhabitants of Kalitz were leaving at once. Our command set up posts at the exits of the city. The soldiers on duty at these posts had to make sure that together with the refugees, Polish soldiers who had somehow managed to avoid being captured did not escape from the city. In the meantime, trucks of field kitchens had entered the city. We had a sumptuous dinner of fried sausages and potatoes, and considering how hungry we were during the day, you can imagine how greedy each of us was for food. For the night, our platoon was housed in one of the large concrete buildings. It was an apartment building, but by the time we arrived, there were none of the occupants. There were scattered things lying around in all the rooms. This clearly indicated that the previous occupants had packed up in a hurry. Anton, Michael, and I were lucky enough to find a loaf of bread and half a head of cheese, as well as a bottle of wine. We celebrated well that all 3 of us were alive after the battle for Kalitz. I was going to write a letter to Ingrid, but I couldn't decide whether I should tell her, at least in general terms, about the fighting. In the end, I decided to leave the letter writing for tomorrow and go to bed. After last night in the trench, it was so nice to lie down in an ordinary soft bed. I dreamed of my home, and in my dream I was happy. The next morning we were again given breakfast at the field kitchen, and were again given only 7 rounds of ammunition each. After that, our entire division again occupied the backs of trucks, and we drove to the northeast. Our destination was the Polish town of Kutno. By this time, several other divisions had already been pooled to it, and the town was besieged. We travelled in the truck all day. From the beginning of the trip, Anton started praising my marksmanship, which allowed me to kill or seriously wound so many Poles. The other guys looked at me with admiration and respect, Perhaps yesterday my marksmanship had saved the life of one of them, but I myself, after I was almost killed by a Polish sniper, was afraid that excessive admiration and praise would dull my vigilance. Therefore, in response to praise, I used to say that my successes were largely due to a good telescopic sight and, perhaps, elementary luck. And you're good, don't be conceited. Michael patted me on the shoulder. The other guys, apparently, also liked that I didn't show off my achievements. Anyway, it was obvious that they all treated me very well. During the road, some of us leaned against the walls of the body, and thanks to this the fighters managed to doze off for a couple or 3 hours in a sitting position. I did not want to sleep, but I closed my eyes and pretended to doze off. I needed to figure out what had happened to me. 2 days ago, I'd vomited after killing living people for the first time. Now I had accepted, or almost accepted, that I would have to do it all the time. Could a person really change so much in just 2 days? Had I become a cold, cruel killer? I couldn't stop thinking about it. But then I remembered the words of Sergeant Berger. If you pity your enemy, it may cost the life of your friend or even yourself. In the 2 days that had passed, I had become convinced that this was indeed true, and that alone made me come to terms with the fact that I was shooting at living people. I had to kill to save my own life and the lives of others. I had no other choice. After realizing this, I calmed down. After it got dark, we drove for about another hour. Finally, our truck stopped. We hadn't reached Kutno yet, but the command decided that we should get some sleep before tomorrow's battles. A whole convoy of our trucks stopped in the middle of the road. We hastily dug shallow trenches and slept in them. In the morning, a hot breakfast of the same sausages was waiting for us again. We were again given 7 rounds of ammunition each, replenished our dry rations and drove on. The town of Kutno was one of the main targets to be captured in the operation. We were now only a few hours away from it. As we approached the town, the sounds of battle came to us more and more clearly. When we were still about an hour away, we heard the deafening rumble of artillery pieces. It did not cease until the end of our journey, and was so intense that it became clear to us that a really huge force had been pulled under the city. Finally, we saw the artillery pieces themselves. They were German 105mm guns. There were more than 100 of them, and they were firing relentlessly. Our truck stopped near the artilleryman's location. On the sergeant's command, we climbed out of the back. I immediately looked around. Between the artillery units and the city stood 2 tank divisions and 1 infantry division. The infantry division had already had time to entrench. Moreover, we could assume that they had been here for quite some time, because among their trenches gaping shell craters. Of course, they could have appeared as a result of underflight of German shells, but most likely it was the work of Polish artillery. On the edge of the city could be seen burned tanks. About 6 of them were German, and among them were both light and medium tanks. Most of the destroyed vehicles, however, were Polish. Looking at the hit Polish tanks through binoculars, I lost count. There were probably about 100 of them, and among them were also both light and medium tanks. However, I was generally surprised that the Poles had armoured vehicles of this kind. A few officers from our division command drove in an armoured car to the headquarters of the operation. We had time to grab a quick bite of our dry rations. "Do you think, Sergeant, we are now thrown into the assault?" I asked Berger. "What else would they be bringing us here for?" He grinned wryly. "But this time at least we will have tank support." Meanwhile, I saw several German bombers in the sky. They carried their deadly cargo to the city, and soon the bursting shells were joined by the deafening rumble of exploding bombs. This time, however, I was no longer deceived. I knew that the Poles would not give up the city without a fight. About half an hour later, the armoured car returned to our division. Our officers hurried to the division commander to receive orders. These orders were then communicated to the sergeants, and within 10 minutes Sergeant Berger had our platoon lined up. "Polish infantry units and artillery have fortified themselves in the city," the sergeant told us. They are entrenched all over the city. They have plenty of anti-tank guns. Our tankers have already tried to take Kutno, but were thrown back by the Poles. Now they'll try to take the town with infantry. They'll send several tank platoons with us. Once again, I felt uneasy. There was a battle ahead of us, which would probably be even harder than the previous one. I thought about the fact that I myself had grown up without a father. Would my little son Kurt suffer the same fate? I won't let that happen, I said to myself. I will do everything I can to make it impossible for my enemies to kill me. I will shoot any of them without pity, if that is what it takes to survive. Meanwhile, Sergeant Berger announced that there were still 20 minutes before the attack could begin, but in that time we must advance as close to the town as possible, taking up positions in the trenches of other German units. The shelling continued. Following Sergeant Berger, I, along with Anton and Michael, crawled up to a trench that was occupied by 3 young soldiers. We went down to them. I looked over the boys. They were ordinary German infantrymen, but all 3 seemed so young, as if they had just graduated from high school. 2 of them were smoking cigars, the same cigars that each of us was issued 2 a day. One of the smokers, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, looked at us and sucked too much smoke into his lungs and coughed. It was obvious that he had only recently started smoking. Perhaps it was to make him seem more mature. After he coughed, he spoke to us. "So, guys, are you getting ready for your first fight?" "No, we have already been in 2 fights," Anton answered and smiled proudly. "No way. Well, you are good." All 3 of them looked at each other. "But we have been kept here behind the tanks for 2 days already." "You'll get enough," Sergeant Berger told them. "There are already dead in our platoon," Michael said glumly, "and we ourselves are just lucky that we didn't get hit by Polish bullets." "Lucky!" exclaimed the second smoker. "German soldiers can do without luck. Our armament is many times superior to the Polish. You should have seen what happened here yesterday. The Poles put a bunch of their airplanes in the air, but they were World War I-era wrecks. Only a few of our Messerschmitts came in, and the Polish planes were smashed to rubble in a matter of minutes." Then the third young soldier spoke. "With the tanks, the same thing happened. To hit one of our tanks, the Poles had to lose 10 of their own." Sergeant Berger gave the 3 a disapproving look. "Certainly our equipment is the best in the world, and of course it is superior to the Polish. Of course we have a numerical advantage, and our soldiers are much better than the Polish. All this means that we will undoubtedly win. But don't think that the Poles will surrender easily. It would be better for them, but they don't realize it. We've already lost some guys. And those who underestimate the enemy, as a rule, are among the first to be added to the lists of the dead." After his words, there was silence. Our sergeant began to look through binoculars at the suburb of Kutno. Meanwhile, the guys began to tell us that yesterday they had been shelled by Polish artillery. They had orders to stay in their positions, but some of the soldiers still jumped out of the trenches and ran. It was the shrapnel that caught up with them. "Then we were convinced that staying in the trenches was really safer," summarized the guy who spoke to us first. "A few shells hit right into the trenches," he said, pointing to the craters. Then he took another drag on his cigar and started coughing again. "But then our artillery and airplanes silenced the Polish artillerymen," he finished, coughing. "After a few minutes our artillery fell silent and we heard the order to attack. Several of our tanks rushed forward and we ran after them. We advanced about 100 meters deep into the city, and the Poles hiding in the suburban buildings opened fire on us. Several soldiers who ran immediately after the tanks immediately collapsed, cut down by machine gun fire. The Poles fired heavy machine guns, rifles, and even artillery pieces. One of the shells fell not far from me, and I saw pieces of the bodies of 2 or 3 soldiers who were near where the shell had fallen, flying in all directions. It all happened so fast that none of us had time to realize it. My survival instinct made me promptly collapse to the ground. I saw several other soldiers do the same. However, the bulk of the soldiers continued to run forward. I hurriedly set my sniper rifle in position and started looking for a target. In one of the windows, I saw a heavy machine gun firing at our guys. I aimed my crosshairs a little above the machine gun. That's where the shooter should be. I pulled the trigger. I thought the machine gun was silent for a while, but after a few seconds I saw that it was firing again. Perhaps I had missed, or perhaps the machine gunner had been replaced by his comrade. Anyway, I pulled the trigger again. After that, the machine gun went silent for good. Looking through the telescopic sight, I continued to search for Polish machine gunners. As a result, in a few minutes, I managed to silence 2 more machine guns. Meanwhile, our tanks continued to advance deep into the city, firing their cannons and machine guns at the Poles. The walls of some Polish houses collapsed before our eyes when tank shells hit them. However, after the work of our artillery and bombers, the city was already full of destroyed houses. Our mortars and machine gunners, armed with MG-34s, were also ceaselessly firing at the enemy. From the rumble of battle, you could literally go deaf. When I was running out of my 3rd magazine of ammunition, I noticed that the Polish fire around me had subsided. I scrutinized the windows of the surrounding houses through a telescopic sight, but did not find a single Polish soldier. The other fighters who were not far from me also realized this. They rushed further into the depths of the city, where shots and explosions were still heard, and I crawled up to several bodies of dead German soldiers to quickly replenish my ammunition supply. When I bent over one of the fallen, he, to my surprise, suddenly groaned. "Help!" There were no medics around. The groaning soldier was wounded in the head. I couldn't tell how serious his wound was. In any case, I had to stop the bleeding. I took a medical pack out of the wounded man's pocket and bandaged his head. After that, there was nothing left for me to do but to hang my rifle around my neck and to carry the wounded man on my shoulders and drag him to the nearest trench on the way out of the town. It was very hard to carry him. In addition, I was very afraid that I would trip and damage my telescopic sight in the fall. And of course, in this situation, I was no longer thinking about looking for some shelter as I moved, so I was a good target for a Polish sniper, if there was one nearby. But it was all over. I dragged the wounded man to the first trench. The medics were there. They rushed around him right away. And I rushed back into the city, to where the sounds of battle could be heard. I moved in short sprints from building to building. As I looked around, I realized that many more houses had been destroyed in Kutno than in Kalisz. At least here in the suburbs there were very few surviving buildings. Shards of bricks, dead horses, broken wagons and human bodies were lying everywhere in the streets. I had to find my platoon. Finally, I saw a 3-story building with rifle barrels sticking out of the second-floor windows, firing toward the center of town. I thought it was German soldiers shooting at Poles. However, it could have been completely different. Ready for anything, I crawled cautiously to the entrance of the building. Above the entrance hung some kind of sign in Polish. The door was closed. At first I wanted to open it, but then I thought that there would be a sentry behind it, who, even if he was German, might shoot, frightened by the suddenness of my appearance. "Are there Germans here? I am mine," I shouted, and immediately hid myself around the corner near the door. At that moment my heart was ready to jump out of my chest. However, after a few seconds, I was relieved to hear German speech. "Yes, there are Wehrmacht soldiers here. Open the door and show yourself." Behind the door, I saw a German soldier standing at the top of the stairs that went straight from the entrance and pointing his rifle at me. When he saw my uniform, he laughed, and I was already afraid that one of the cunning Poles had learned our language. "Come upstairs." As I went up the steps, I saw 3 snipers huddled in the room opposite the windows. They were all from some other platoon. The 4th one who let me in was also a sniper. This was clear as his rifle also had a scope on it. I had lost my peace. I gave the number of my platoon, company, regiment, and division. "Do you know where they are? I'm afraid I'll be accused of desertion." As I said these words, I thought that I might actually be in for a nasty story. The 3 snipers kept firing from the windows, not taking their eyes off me. The one who let me in first shrugged, then smiled. "Stay with us for the rest of the battle. We'll confirm that you were with us." He extended his hand to me. "My name is Felix." "Gunther," I introduced myself. His handshake was quite strong. I headed for the vacant window to also open fire on the Poles, and at that moment a bullet entered exactly in the eye of one of Felix's co-workers. "Holy shit!" Felix immediately jumped up to him and immediately realized that there was nothing to help. The other snipers hurriedly fell to the floor. None of them had time to notice the Polish sniper, which meant that he could shoot them all while they were looking for him. "We need to change positions, or we'll all be dead," I said. The others agreed with me. Felix broke off half of the dead man's soldier's medallion. I reached for his ammo pouch, but immediately caught the disapproving looks of the others. "We're only issued 7 rounds a day. I have to replenish my supply somehow. But this time I probably shouldn't have," I said, embarrassed. "No, that's right," said Felix. "The dead man won't need the cartridges anymore, and we'll be lost without them." I divided equally the cartridges of the dead sniper. At the same time, I involuntarily looked at his blood-soaked face with a gaping hole in the left eye. I myself could at any moment repeat the same unenviable fate. The other snipers must have thought the same thing. At any rate, one of them was hysterical. He was trembling, huddled in a corner of the room. Felix crawled over to him and slapped his cheeks. After that, the guy sort of came to his senses, and we all cautiously left the building together. Using the buildings and ruins of houses we encountered as cover, we moved in a northeastern direction, approaching the center of the city. After a couple of streets, we saw a German platoon taking up positions behind a thicket of ornamental shrubbery. The guys were watching a Polish tank that was moving toward them. Several Polish infantrymen were running alongside the tank. The enemy probably did not notice the German platoon hiding behind the shrubbery, and therefore none of them opened fire. In the hands of one of the men of the German platoon, I saw a massive anti-tank gun. He took aim at the tank and fired. There was a rumble as if 5 ordinary rifles had been fired simultaneously. Through my telescopic sight, I saw a hole in the frontal armor of the tank. The Poles immediately opened fire. The tank machine gun rumbled. Acting automatically, I aimed my sight at the machine gunner's viewport and pulled the trigger. The first time I missed, my bullet must have ricocheted off the armor. I fired again. After my third shot, the tank machine gun went silent. Meanwhile, other snipers and guys from the infantry platoon had already killed some of the Poles accompanying the tank. The rest of the enemy infantrymen hid behind the tank and continued to fire at us. I don't know why the tank gun was silent. Perhaps the shot from the anti-tank gun destroyed the very one who was supposed to fire it. Perhaps the Polish tank was not quite serviceable. I decided to try to hit the Polish soldiers hiding behind the tank, but then one of our soldiers ran out from behind cover and threw a grenade at the tank. He jumped out so suddenly that the Poles did not have time to realize, and he safely jumped back into cover. "Get down!" yelled the sergeant in charge of the infantry platoon. We all pressed into the ground, and at the same second there was an explosion. The tank caught fire, and a few seconds later there was another explosion, much more powerful. Apparently the tank's ammunition had exploded. It was obvious that everyone inside the tank was killed. The same fate befell most of the Poles hiding behind the tank. However, 2 or 3 of them were wounded. One of them reached for his rifle. Our infantrymen, heated by the battle, immediately shot them all. Taking my eye off the scope, I looked around me and saw the soldier who had fired the anti-tank rifle. He was dead. His entire chest was riddled with bullets. It was clearly the work of a tank machine gun. I came closer and saw that the dead man's face was drenched in blood. It had probably come out of his mouth before he died. The sergeant in charge of the platoon walked over to the dead man and broke off half of his soldier's medallion. Another soldier, probably a friend of the dead man, walked up to him and hastily muttered a funeral prayer. No one else seemed to care about the dead man. Then Felix and 2 other snipers approached him. "Maybe we should take his anti-tank gun," I suggested. Felix picked up the dead soldier's rifle from the ground and hummed, "Wow, how much it weighs! It's as big as a cannon." I took the anti-tank gun from his hands and examined it. The caliber of the barrel is the same 8mm as in our rifles, I wondered. Why does it hit so powerfully that it penetrates the armour? Felix, by this time, was already twirling a huge anti-tank gun cartridge in his hands. "Look," he told me, "the caliber here is the same as in the rifle, but the bullet is much more massive and the powder is several times more." Meanwhile, the sniper, who had been nervous when we were in the house, was looking at the dead man and shaking nervously again. "Why are you shaking like a woman?" I yelled to sober him up. "Are we going to have dead people around us all the time now?" he said deftly. "You get used to it quickly," I said, deliberately cheerful. I thought to myself, am I getting used to it? The anti-tank gun was very heavy indeed, but I took it with me, as well as its ammunition. The dead man had as many as 19 of them left. He only had time to fire one shot. Following the infantry, we continued to move from house to house. I held my K98K carbine in my hands, and the anti-tank gun hung on my shoulder. It caused a lot of inconvenience when moving around, but I expected that this gun would still serve me well. Looking ahead, I will say that in principle it did, but only once, and I had a great deal of tension with it. Soon we approached a massive brick 3-story building. Judging by its appearance, it had formerly housed a school. Now, however, it was full of Polish soldiers who were firing from the windows of the first and second floors. The roof and the third floor of the building had been almost completely destroyed by shells and bombs, and all the glass in it had been blown out, but in spite of this it looked quite strong. I couldn't get too good a look at it, though. I took up a position about 300 meters away from it, and the houses next to this 3-story building were on fire, and it was hard to see anything because of the smoke. The German machine gunners were working on the building very tightly. After their bursts, bricks broke off the walls of the school every now and then. However, every few minutes one of our machine gunners was killed. It became clear to me that the Poles had a sniper. I told Felix about it, and all 4 of us began to look through the windows of the school through our telescopic sights in search of the sniper's position. Through the smoke it was very difficult to see, but I noticed that in one of the windows of the ruined 3rd floor periodically flashes at the end of a rifle barrel, and almost simultaneously with this flash silenced some of the German machine guns. Of course, that was where the enemy sniper was hiding. He was so sure of his safety that he didn't even bother to change his position. I whispered to Felix, "The sniper is on the 3rd floor among the ruins. See the flashes at the end of the barrel? Let's shoot him all at once just to be sure."